Welcome to Windows on the World. I've got a special guest here tonight I'm going to introduce in a moment. I've just been down to a very interesting event hosted by George Galloway down at the Camden Irish Centre. And the event was known as Russia House. There was George Galloway chairing it and Adam Gary from RT plus Alexander Necroshoff. And we're going to be talking about him in a little while. Piers Corbyn was also in attendance, and the actual event was about the Russian poisoning. This event that's all over the place. And funnily enough, I've just got a friend of mine who's working as a cameraman for the BBC down in Salisbury, and he sent me a text which actually explains the narrative quite well. He said, "Everyone down here knows it's bollocks, mate." Which was it seems to be the general consensus of everything, actually. And the BBC have sort of embarrassed themselves even more by saying, "Spy poisoning, Russia stockpiling nerve agent, says Boris Johnson." So this is Piers Corbyn in the background laughing. But Boris has actually said that Russia has been stockpiling the nerve agent used in the attack on an ex-spy and his daughter over the last decade. He also dismissed a suggestion by Russia's EU ambassador that the agent might have come from a UK laboratory. Vladimir Chitsov had said the Porton Down lab in Wiltshire may have been the source of the substance. Sergei and Yulia Skripal remained critically ill in hospital after being exposed to the substance in Salisbury. They were found slumped on a bench in the Wiltshire city on the 4th of March. Now, that's almost got comedic connotations within itself, really, but not for them. And we've gone into this today, the background of it and the Russian perspective on it. We're going to find out in a minute, and that was very, very revealing. And yes, we'll do a bit of introduction to that. But basically, yeah, this story all over the UK BBC News with Boris Johnson making these statements. Usually the sort of statements that Boris makes are largely uninformed, and this is particularly uninformed, but it carries on. UK Prime Minister Theresa May told MPs that Porton Down, Britain's military research base, identified the substance used as being part of a group of military-grade nerve agents known as Novichok, developed by the Soviet Union. Mr Johnson told the BBC's Andrew Marr show, "We actually have evidence within the last 10 years that Russia has not only been investigating the delivery of nerve agents for the purposes of assassination, but has also been creating and stockpiling Novichok, which according to the Russians doesn't actually exist." So it's quite interesting that we get to the Johnson perspective. Now, we've got Piers Corbyn with us, and he's been passing me some very interesting information. Maybe he's going to talk about some of that. But you were there at the Q&A and had to come back for the show, Piers. So what did you make of it?
Well, a very important event run by George Galloway and the two people he brought along. And I think the key thing that comes out of it for me and anyone that has the slightest bit of knowledge of what the Secret Service and spies get up to is that they will never assassinate people who have been spy swapped. Because if you're one country and you do a spy swap and then your guy comes back to you and then he's assassinated by the other side, there's no point in ever doing spy swaps. So they will never assassinate the spy swaps. So the idea the Russians have somehow done this against this guy that was spy swapped is complete nonsense. George Galloway and others made certain points to the effect, look, we don't know who's done it. It could be an internecine strife thing between different Russian groups. This guy has had dealings with all sorts. We don't know what oligarchy he likes or he doesn't like. We just don't know. But one thing is clear, and all the speakers and the audience agreed that this has been used by the deep state in order to strengthen themselves and push around various governments across Europe, including Britain. And it's also been used to attack my brother and make him look like some sort of Russian sympathizing agent and so forth, which is complete nonsense. He's also always stood for freedom of speech in Russia and everywhere, and is certainly not part of any spy network, and never has been and never will.
Well, despite having a Russian hat on and being seen on the BBC in front of the Kremlin, Piers.
Well,
I mean,
of course,
this is ridiculous. How can you say this?
Except that was Photoshop nonsense.
Well, I know that.
Well, they may well have Photoshopped nonsense that they probably got a number of Photoshops. They might have pictures of me and Mark outside the Kremlin with Russian hats on. Who knows? But, you know, I mean, that is the lowest level of propaganda you can imagine. And with alternative media, such as Windows on the World, this nonsense can be exposed. But you see, the BBC are on a kind of old-fashioned track of trying to continually, again, upset my brother, trying to stir up things in the Labour Party or support those who stir them up in order to try and remove him. So the Blairites are rallying again in the name of saving the country. But of course, it's actually Jeremy that stands for democracy, not them.
Well, the chap who we're going to hear from in a minute, Alexander Necroshoff, actually tweeted this earlier today. He said, "This time I am in agreement with Owen Jones. Don't turn off everybody. It gets better. The BBC should not have made Corbyn look like a Kremlin spy with that silly background imagery. But on the other hand, the BBC is so unpopular that it probably made him even more appealing to many people," which I think is a very, very good point, because it's so ridiculous now that it couldn't get more ridiculous. And this friend of mine who's working down in Salisbury has been texting me all about what's been happening down there. And apparently it's a bit of a comedy show for the locals as well, even though obviously people are ill. Well, not obviously, we don't know, do we? But the point being that even the people who are on the inner circle of the BBC aren't really taking it seriously, which actually does bring to the fore what are they doing working for them. I mean, we were talking about integrity of journalists earlier on, and those with their noses in the trough who know about this are pretty despicable, in my opinion. What do you think about that, Piers?
Well, I agree with you completely. I mean, it is such complete nonsense. I mean, George Galloway made the point. He said, look, hang on. If there's a serious investigation into who did what here, you expect a bit of CCTV footage or reportage out of the hospital as to how these guys are doing. But there's none of that, right? And it being near Porton Down, the British Chemical Biological Warfare headquarters, then there must be a CCTV place every 50 or 100 yards. But there's been no CCTV footage of these guys or their alleged attackers or whatever. So, you know, the whole thing just smells, you know.
Yeah, it seems a bit desperate to me. And you've been looking into different scenarios of what this might actually be about in the forthcoming weeks. And have you got anything you'd like to share with us on that?
Well, I would say it could be some attempt to sort of the European Union to kind of draw people together against Russia, you see. I mean, because that's what they've done. They've all stood up and said Russia's bad. It'll probably backfire on them, but that's what they've done. And the other thing is, I'm very certain of this, it's a scenario to attack and undermine my brother, brand him as some sort of baddie, and encourage or assist the Blairites in another attempted coup. Now, whether they'll go ahead with it, who knows? But, you know, that's the sort of thing they're up to. They want to do everything they can to weaken him. And Jeremy has to stand firm and is standing firm, and people have to rally around and prevent these monstrous stories, because they are monstrous stories without a grain of truth in them.
That's very true, and it's been going on for a long time. And, of course, we've had the BBC jumping on the bandwagon of the Joe Cox murder, and that was to demonise people who vote Brexit. We were going to talk today, carry on what we were talking about last few weeks with the propaganda, the way it's actually being put into the media now, that there's this problem with far-right extremism, when that actually came from MI5, then went down through the think tanks, and it's now into the mainstream. So that's another really important issue that we're going to get to a bit later. But first of all, I'd like to play this audio from Alexander Necroshoff, because I think it puts things perfectly into perspective. Now, this chap was born in Russia in 1957, came to Britain in the 60s with his mother and stepfather. In 1979, he returned to Russia to study at the Moscow State University for International Relations, where he read politics, international law and economics. Alexander then worked for TASS, the Soviet press agency, first as a reporter and later as a political correspondent. After moving to TASS's London office in 1989, Alexander covered major events in Britain and Europe, interviewing leading politicians, entertainers, and even members of paramilitary groups in Northern Ireland. He investigated high-level corruption, tracked down mafia bosses, and uncovered international crime activity. In the mid-1990s, he travelled the world as a troubleshooter for the Kremlin. So can we have that audio, please, Tony?
By the way, what I find remarkable is that even during this campaign, and this is obviously a propaganda campaign, I don't understand how any person, even with half a brain, can fall for this rubbish, that somebody poisoned from the Russian state, poisoned these people. Now, first of all, I'd like to tell you something about poisonings and contract hits, or whatever you call it. I remember a general said from the KGB, he said to me, if there is a hit and everybody at once knows who is behind it, that means the local intelligence organized it. Because no way would any intelligence carry out a hit and you would know. So please, remember that. How come they knew the next day or the same day? Very strange, isn't it? That they knew at once. And obviously, the funniest bit about this story is that there was never a poison gas in the arsenal of the Soviet Union or Russia called Novichok, newcomer. Unfortunately, the name comes from a British-American television series, Strike Back, where this name appeared for the first time, and it seems the MI5 boys decided that's a good name, let's use this, which is bizarre. I mean, to be honest with you, I would sack the head of the intelligence for that alone. I mean, at least if you prepare a provocation, at least research the issue and do something properly. Now, I would like to say that I've been here for what, 29 years now. And if you add the previous years, that would be probably 40 years in Britain. And I know the press here better than even anybody else. Because I had to work with that press all that time. I had to be, when I was a journalist, I had to, read the papers every day to know what they're writing and so on. And I can tell you that there's a big problem with the coverage. And the coverage shows me that it is a provocation. Why? Well, very simple. First of all, no decent hacker would write from the word go that it is a Russian murder. He couldn't have known this. You have to have time to investigate it, right? But the next day, when the news came, all newspapers started accusing Russia. The biggest sign that it is a propaganda campaign is very simple. Every paper writes in exactly the same way, in exactly the same words, only one subject. Where's the daddy? Who is giving the orders? I always ask Western hacks, by the way. I say, how come that every subject you take, be it Brexit, Russia, well, Trump as well, by the way, although I don't like him, but, let's take that subject. Syria, Libya, Iraq. How come, I say, that you have the same angle, all of you? Why is there no difference in your coverage? Who tells you to write like this? Because you can't think all in the same way. I'll tell you how it's done, if you don't know. It's done through briefings for editors, who then pass it on to hacks who are working for them. So when you say to me, the free press in Britain, I'm sorry guys, you didn't have the free press since 1980s. It was gone. It was taken out. Because your political rulers, not only in Britain but everywhere, decided, we'd better keep them in the dark because, things might happen. Now, the problem with politics generally, it can be any country. The biggest crimes committed by politicians are because they're trying to hide their incompetence. Don't search for all these, majestical reasons, conspiracies, complicated conspiracies. These people in politics are mostly stupid buffoons who can't, if they go out of politics, they will never find a proper job, ever. That's why they come in, they have not ever held a job properly, or proper job, and they start to make terrible mistakes or just, basically destroy everything. But in order to cling to the job, they have to lie. Because how do you stay on when everything is falling apart? Look at George Osborne. I mean, that's a classical example. Never worked anywhere. Suddenly, he is the chancellor. He doesn't understand anything. What does he do? He rushes to the banks. And he was meeting them every day. And the banks simply tore Britain apart. You know how much they stole under one Osborne? I would say $1.5 trillion. That's taxpayers' money mostly. Hey, that's nice, isn't it? So the point is that this incompetence causes all these political upheavals because they are starting to lie. George mentioned Tony Blair. Tony Blair was a pathological liar. From day one, he had nothing to do with Labour. Nothing. This was not Labour. This was neo-Bolshevism. Neo-Bolshevism. This is the worst kind. I don't even know was it left or right. I don't know. Neo-Bolshevism is basically you destroy your own country for the sake of something, which you don't even know. Mostly money. He was mostly about money. By the way, in 1996, I had a regular slot on Radio 5 Live. A very popular show, by the way. And before the elections, I said on the show that if you elect that man your prime minister, he will turn you into another Belgium. He's a liar. Don't do it. People, I was saying it several times on different shows. For that I paid later when he came to power and ordered Alistair Campbell to take me out, in the sense that not poison or kill, but to sack me from the BBC, because they realized they have a voice on the BBC, a man against them and hitting them where it hurts. The lying, the falsification of economic stats. Well, I'm sorry, George, but education is what Lenin said in 1918, and then destroyed education. The same happened with Blair. Education, and then he destroyed. But you know what he meant? He meant we must control education, because otherwise we will not hold to power. He had nothing to do with improving anything. So they were neo-Bolsheviks, and I personally think that since Blair, politicians in Britain are working against Britain. I'm sorry, but that's how I feel. I think Cameron was also anti-British. I think, I don't even want to talk about Gordon Brown, because Gordon Brown was, I think, mentally unfit to be Prime Minister, but Gordon Brown was continuing the same level. And Theresa May, she's probably confused, but she's just doing what they did. Now, the problem with Britain at the moment is that Brexit suddenly unsettled everything in politics here. Nobody was ready for that. The government, no one. Brexit, and that's where I disagree with Farage and UKIP completely. Brexit had nothing to do with immigration. Nothing at all. As a tiny issue, it was immigration. But when UKIP and Farage said that immigration is the issue, that's why people voted Brexit, they immediately basically pushed away all the good people, good immigrants, who work hard, who contribute, and suddenly they were told, no, we don't like you. We don't like you. That was such a huge mistake that I told all the Farage's deputies who follow me on Twitter, by the way, religiously, you should read my Twitter, because I sometimes stir trouble, because I sometimes provide information which is sort of a joker information, but it's not. Because that's how you know, you entertain people and you also educate them or help them to understand the reason. So I told those people that Farage, in my opinion, is a traitor. But I said, okay, you would be probably upset by that. I would say he's just a fool. And he doesn't understand what he's talking about. The main essence of Brexit, and the reason I'm talking about Brexit, because I'll come to Russia in a second. The main essence of Brexit is that British people said no to liberal values and policies which were imposed on them and shoved down their throats by, starting from Major, by the way, because nobody sort of, everybody thinks Major was a conservative.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and that's why I wanted to play it in its entirety, because I thought he hit some really good points there. And these are the sort of points that we just don't hear anywhere in the mainstream. And I love hearing it from the Russians, because they are actually very good at being direct about this stuff. I mean, he made some great points there. But the other thing about this is, we were talking about it last week, we don't generally go into specific politics week to week. We go into a much bigger generalized picture of what's behind it all. But I thought this was a very important thing to do, because it ties into, again, what we talk about a lot, and the intelligence services. Where is this stuff coming from? I mean, the stuff that we're getting from MI5 then goes straight into demos, goes into think tanks, and then all of a sudden it's all around the media. And we've covered this for years on end with papers that they produced along with the British Psychological Association. All this stuff filters down. And this story, according to the horse's mouth there, the guy who actually works for a long time in this field, is absolute nonsense. But I think it's obvious that it's absolute nonsense to most people. I wanted to ask Piers what he thought this was about, because I can't really understand how they think they're going to get away with this. Or is it just that we've reached this level with the mainstream now that they think that this is acceptable and maybe they can't be bothered? What do you think about it?
Well, yeah, I think largely they can't be bothered. You see, the BBC and the mainstream media have a knee-jerk reaction to things, which is a bit like how Goebbels treated the public. Namely, you tell them a big lie often enough and they will believe it. Now, mainstream media still believe that is the case and they are acting in this way. However, we do have an alternative media, which, if it had happened in Germany before the war, Hitler would never have got to power, of course, you see. So there are different things going on with alternative media, which makes their way of doing things actually much more difficult than they imagine. But they still proceed, because how else can they proceed? I think the points made by Alexander there were really very, very telling indeed, actually. And it's true, the Brexit decision by the people has unsettled everything. And it's not the case that people were voting for anything like racist reasons or anything. And there could be a small number like that. But I mean, basically, it's people don't like having certain standards shoved down their throats, and they don't like the idea of being ruled from elsewhere. I mean, we all have criticisms of a parliament, but at least it's our parliament, as opposed to the European Union diktats, which are not ours. And I think that is the essence of it. And also, of course, how the European Union exploits the British public hand over fist, and how through things like climate change nonsense, we've had the justification for deindustrialising the north of England. And forcing down wages by having an open borders policy, which does not include insisting that everybody has to be paid the minimum wage. So there's a whole lot of reasons that any thinking or working person realises are bad from the European Union. So that is why we must leave. The powers that be, though, of course, they want the European Union because they want this open door for Wall Street, the biggest capitalists around, to exploit and dispossess, if you like, deindustrialise the European Union, and eventually use the European Union to take over industries or lack of industries or services in the European Union. I mean, that's what they're about. But Wall Street isn't the same as Donald Trump, of course, because Wall Street also detest Donald Trump.
This is the really interesting thing, because there's something about both Trump and your brother that really, really destabilizes their idea in the respect that they are not exactly what is wanted by the powers that be. In other words, there's a slight bit of unpredictability. And now a lot of people are going to say, oh, Trump this, Trump that. They can go on about Corbyn. But the point is that these two are slightly out of the mould. And I think that's what worries them. That is clear that worries them to me.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Obviously, Trump and my brother would disagree on very many things. But they have one thing in common. Neither of them can be bought. My brother can't be bought because he has principles, and Trump can't be bought because he's got loads of money anyway, and there's no point in trying to buy him, right? And beyond that, of course, that means they can act in certain independent ways, not for the deep state, either in Europe or in Britain, United Kingdom, or in America, and that's why they're both detested by the mainstream media. The mainstream media in both these countries are essentially agents of the deep state, and that is what the Democrat Party is at present, and that's why it's actually losing support in America, and Trump is gaining. Whatever you might think about some of Trump's policies, he's actually gaining support.
Yes. And what's being put in front of us here is just really a pantomime. And I was talking last night, I did a talk, and was talking about this sort of idea of unstructured governance, which is where everything really happens, and the public are just fed lies. They're fed a lie, which is split into two lies. And I think that's what's really coming into the fore now with what we're seeing. We don't, as I say, usually cover these sort of stories because a lot of the people who listen to this show can do their own dissection of this sort of evidence. But as we attended that event today, I thought it was good because even just for what that chap there was saying, Alexander Necroshoff, because you will not hear anything like that on the mainstream. And it's so simple and so direct, and it makes absolute sense. And this is why I've always found that the background to all this and this the global action plan, which nobody seems to know about, which is implemented at a local level, which we talk about all the time, which is not known by the useful idiots who are promoting it. Because what's behind them is unstructured government that they will never know about. And I think this chap actually highlighted that very, very much in what he was saying. That's why I liked it, because it's like a no-nonsense approach. And, yeah, we need more of that. But, Piers, have you got anything else that you'd like to add before we move on?
No, I think move on to see what else is said at that meeting. But, I think those are very good points that have been made. And people have to look behind what is going on. If you see some mad news about my brother, about Trump, about any politician, actually, ask yourself, well, maybe you ask, is it true? But you should also ask, why am I hearing this? In whose interest are you hearing this? And you can see then that, these stories have been shoved and pushed around and created largely by the BBC in order to discredit my brother and Brexit and so forth, you see.
Absolutely, and that brings us back again to the BBC, because I was going to talk about some initiative they have called Media Action. And it's quite interesting because what they seem to be doing is embedding people all over the world who are going to be mouthpieces for their propaganda. And they're training people into this and mentoring them. And they have mentoring programs. And I'll just go into that first of all, and then I will tell you what I sent to them. The BBC Media Action, how people use, access and communicate information around the world has profound implications for development, diplomatic and foreign policy. Now that's very interesting, isn't it? How people use, access and communicate information around the world has profound implications for development, diplomatic and foreign policy. Now, they seem to be, from what I can see of this website, they are trying to embed themselves in the business of countries here. They are putting in change agents and people, useful idiots, in power to control the narrative in these countries. Now, that is way beyond what they should be doing, in my opinion. So it carries on. This area of the BBC Media Action website is designed to inform policy, Now, wait a minute.
That's not reportage, is it? That's something else.
No, this is propaganda, and they're basically saying that they are propaganda outlets.
Like the old World Service, BBC World Service, that's what it was for.
Yes, but to inform policy. Now, this is meant to be our independent, totally independent, unbiased British media. And they're telling us that they want to inform policy here. This area of the BBC Media Action website is designed to inform policy, research and practice on the role of media as it relates to the main priorities of BBC Media Action, which includes governance and rights, health, and resilience and humanitarian response. Now, that can mean anything, can't it? Yeah, that can actually mean interfering in the internal politics of a country. Designed for development, policymakers and researchers who may not be specialists in media and communications. Research and Insight is a space where BBC Media Action can share its policy analysis, insight and research findings, and where these issues can be debated and interrogated. Now, this is interesting. They use this word
policy analysis. I mean, what the hell is this? I mean, come on. That's how much good or bad for a country. I mean, is it good for the Greeks to starve under the jurisdiction of the European Central Bank? Yes or no? I mean, doubtless they're going to say yes because they need to be taught a lesson. Well, I would say no because they've got a right to eat.
Well, exactly. And the more I peel away this stuff with the BBC, the more disturbing it gets.
Horrific, isn't it? It's scary. It is frankly scary stuff.
So I sent them an email. I said, "Can you please tell me what exactly you mean by mentoring journalists? I am concerned that the BBC does not actually employ any journalists. If I do not receive a response, I will assume that you have nothing to say to the public on this matter." Guess what? No response. So they don't have anything to say to the public about this at all. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing about the BBC here. We've covered this a lot, and we did a show called BBC Fake Reality Exposed, where we went back on their biggest lies. There's an interesting article I found from Craig Murray from 2016 when he was talking about this alleged attack of Stella Creasy because she had people outside her home who were demonstrating against the war in Syria, which was not actually the case because I know someone who lives opposite there. They just went round to talk to her and she wouldn't come out of the office. But of course, she claimed to be a victim of a mob. And this is always what happens with these MPs. This is something I want to bring up, Piers, because this is really important. Like this sort of idea that people are getting abused on Twitter. I've been over it before, but it's absolutely ridiculous that people would even say that because nobody is going to make a threat on Twitter that they're going to carry out. It's absolutely stupid. So it's people on the spur of the moment basically venting their spleen against these public servants. And if these public servants cannot take it and basically for what it is, which is rhetoric, then they should resign their positions, in my opinion. I mean, I feel very strongly about this, Piers, because it's a constant thing in the media of whinging, people whinging about their jobs. Now, the thing is that I worked in entertainment for a long time. You have to go there, you have to put up with everybody in the building, you have to let people hassle you, you have to please everybody, you have to listen to the person who's going to pay you for 25 minutes to an hour after the show with a full analysis of everything and how much they want you back and all the rest of it. And then you have to put up with drunks, then you have to load the car up. No, to me, this is part of the job. I wouldn't say I've been abused tonight because someone didn't like my act and I've actually had people come up to me after the show and they kept me out of my car. So I couldn't get into my car to go home because they wanted to talk to me about something. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And this actually is something that really gets up my nose, as you can tell. But this is what they do. They take it down to trivia and the real issues are not addressed. And what it seems to me is that people like Stella Creasy, I am going to pull her out as an example, she has this trivial mindset. There's things happening in that borough like this mini Holland thing and this regeneration, which we talk about a lot, and what it actually is, the Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 principles. She knows nothing about them. And they will never address issues that really matter. And then, of course, it's all about being a victim. And this is absolutely where the BBC come in, because they're always pushing this narrative. And then we've got The next thing is the far right. Now, I've done a bit of investigation into this, and I'd like to tell MI5 that there isn't a threat from the far right in this country. So why don't they go out and actually drive around the country and find out what is going on? We talked about this last week with these people called the South East Alliance. Now, they could be construed as say, well, yeah, we don't want immigration and we're up for British values. And we mentioned that last week, that we've got this organisation called Hope Not Hate, who are constantly, that basically all they're doing is reinforcing the rhetoric from MI5. So they must be an arm of the intelligence services, again, a bit like Demos. They start putting these articles, well, Hope Not Hate is probably two people on a website, but it attacks people that we know, myself and Piers know, and they're people who are old age pensioners who get together in meeting rooms to talk about what the establishment and the BBC would call conspiracy theories. These are not people who are a threat to the state. And these organizations start attacking these people, and it's like a comedy, really. And this is where I think it brings us back to this Russian intelligence idea, that they just tell you what things are, and then you have to draw your own conclusions. They don't treat you like an idiot, but these people they constantly harass anybody who they want to label. And it's a kind of form of terrorism which is allowed. So we've got this far right narrative. In conclusion to that little rant, Piers, have you seen any evidence of this rise in the far right that MI5 and Demos are talking about?
None whatsoever. I mean, I think the BBC, the big mainstream media, and deep state, for the sake of a description, but the leading lights in the certain political parties will use two things against things they don't agree with. They label them either far right or Russian agents, one or the other. And both of the stories are generally speaking nonsense. There is a far right, yes, of course there is, but it's a trivial, it's a nonsense thing. And there may be Russian agents around, but they're certainly not my brother, for example. It's just poppycock stories to try.
So you're telling me, Piers, that despite him having a Russian hat and being pictured outside the Kremlin, that he's not a Russian agent? That's ridiculous.
He wasn't pictured outside the Kremlin, but anyway, enough said.
I just thought I'd bring it on as a running gag.
Right, okay. The media, you see, the BBC in particular, they would be respected if they actually spent their time dealing with facts and reporting facts. But you could just list over the last few years a number of things where they've done the opposite of report the facts, namely they've made up stories. Orgreave and the miners' strike, they made up stories. Hillsborough, they made up stories. And in both instances, they were part of the lie machine with sections of the police to misinform the public. The case of Jimmy Savile. They spent ages covering up paedophilia in the BBC. And the cover was blown. Next one, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. A complete pack of lies. But they were promoting it for a while. And then, of course, now we have the climate change, another complete nonsense lie coming out of the United Nations, just like weapons of mass destruction. Now, a lot of people believe it right now, but, it won't be long before they start realising that actually all this cold weather is not caused by global warming. And we are being fed a lie in order to support the European Union and the price increases of energy and electricity, and to justify the industrialisation of northern Britain and northern USA, for example. When the media come up with things, ask why, and basically when they repeat something many times, it's probably not true.
In conclusion to that little section, I'd just like to read this out. This was about the alleged intimidation of MPs about the Syrian war. It says on Craig Murray's blog here, 2 listeners complained that the programme had inaccurately reported that a peaceful vigil in Walthamstow in protest against the decision to bomb targets in Syria had targeted the home of the local MP Stella Creasy and had been part of a pattern of intimidation towards Labour MPs who had supported the decision. The claim that the demonstration had targeted Miss Creasy's home and the implication that it was intimidatory in nature originated from a single Facebook posting, which later proved to be misleading. The demonstration's destination was Mrs. Creasy's constituency office, as we said earlier, which was unoccupied at the time, not her home, and it was peaceful, so she wasn't even there.
No, No, it's an absurd story to try and undermine people who've got a democratic right to protest and make a point against any different politician. You know, I mean, it applies for any politician. Has to be able to be criticised and questioned.
Yeah. Anyway, that's probably enough of the BBC. But I think he brought up some other important things which I'd like to go into now, which is common core education. When he was talking, Alexandra Necroshoff was talking about the destruction of education. I thought he made a really good point because, well, according to UNESCO, no child will be left behind in this global education program, and education is not complete until the child has been changed. Now, this is very interesting. Yeah, this comes from UNESCO as well. So they're talking about education as a way of gatekeeping people until they're 40, basically. This is really what's happening. And it's been stated in these documents that over the weeks we've put out, including the talk by Dr. Richard Day in 1969, which you can find as Social Engineers Then and Now. There's two parts to that, which is absolutely fascinating. This chap in 1969 at Mount Sinai Hospital, who was an insider, and he was with the what became the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Planned Parenthood, of course, and he outlined what was going to happen in the next 40 to 50 years, and everything that he outlined has happened, including what's happened with education, but even up to the point, quite astonishingly, he said in the future people are going to be running everywhere, all over the streets, and everyone's going to be wearing training shoes. And he said that in 1969. So that level of detail I find absolutely fascinating. And those interviews, yes, well, the transcript's there from somebody who was actually, this guy said, turn off your tape machine, stop taking notes, I'm going to give you an outline of what's going to happen. And what he was actually saying to the students, which other people miss out, is that he was trying to warn them to see who would do something, because he said that the reason this is going to happen is because you are compliant and you're going to let it happen. And he was very weary about this because he could not see how an alternative could be found at the time to this new form of global governance. So that is what this show's about, really, is bringing those sort of things up and putting them into that context. And David Icke did put out this Dr. Richard Day lecture, and he's talked about it quite a lot. But I think the thing to highlight is that the people, the social engineers who are involved in this, who maybe don't want to be involved in this, are actually saying, well, it's only going to get better if you actually do some research and start doing something about it and understand what the system you're in actually is. And it's a big thing that we cover: liability within the system, about what you are within the system, why you have a birth certificate, why you are property in a court. All these things are extremely important, and they are what actually brings the state into being, because these assumptions that we are property are very important, especially when we are getting abused by this news media like the BBC, who have taken it upon themselves to be the state broadcasting apparatus, which keeps us uninformed. And if we go to what's behind that, then we'll see the bigger picture. And that's what we try and go into every week. And we do go into it in quite a lot of depth and detail. But that's that for that section. And we're going to take a short break soon. But in conclusion, Piers, have you anything to say?
Well, I think the stuff about education is really very insightful. You see, Alexandra referred to Tony Blair saying education, education, education. And what he meant was, we're going to use education to control, and we're going to develop it. Now, I've noticed, and having been a chair of governors in a school some time ago, that more and more education big problem, because the role of science as taught to children is everything has to be based on experiment and evidence. But the schools come up with diktats about what is right to believe on sexuality, on climate, on anything. Right? They tell children what is correct politically, but that may indeed contradict, a scientific analysis, and some children realise that. So they got a problem there, but the general trend is to use education very, very much more strongly to impose ideology on children. And I think that is very dangerous. And teachers generally work very hard, and they probably believe they're doing the best for the children and so on to get them through exams. Indeed, they are doing the best for the children to get them through exams. But the exams are ideologically weighted. So I think anything in schools to encourage real debate as opposed to fake debates, a la BBC, has to be encouraged. And anyone who's got anything to do with the school and hear their children say something that you think is actually a bit of an imposition, say, well, what about having a discussion in the school about it? School debating societies are very good places, but not what they used to be, I think. So what I'm saying is that real debate has to be discussed in schools, and teachers have to be called to task when they're imposing things often which they don't understand themselves, but they've just been told what to say.
Well, as far as higher education goes, you've been
it's the same problem
shut down with that. That's what I was getting to. Your views are not accepted within a lot of establishments within London, including University College.
Yes, University College, a very good case in point. Now, the University College, London, was the first non-religious university, quite likely in the world, in the Western world anyway. But 2 years ago, when we tried to hold a conference there from climate realists, people who don't believe in the man-made climate change story and have evidence to show that it's nonsense, we had a conference booked and organised and ready to go, and the authorities closed it down and said, no, we can't hold it there, and they moved it. It had to be moved to Conway Hall, which is fine, it happened, but it's an insult to all those who stand for academic freedom that this happened. Now, recently, a little group in University College called the Life Ethics Society organised a debate. They managed to get it through because they were like part of the college. Originally, their idea was just to invite me to speak, and then they managed to draw other people in to speak. Very interesting, and we did have a discussion about whether or not man-made climate change is true. And they invited along the Green Party, Natalie Bennett, and a guy from Oxford, a scientist from Oxford, a climate scientist. Both of them refused to come, but instead we had two guys from Imperial College, research students, from the Grantham Institute, which is basically a poppycock machine to propagate man-made climate change nonsense. However, they came along, and to be fair, they gave a presentation of the standard, their sort of standard justification for their theory, but they basically failed completely to answer very basic questions from me, like question one: how come, if what you say is true, that actual observations show that carbon dioxide levels follow world temperatures, not lead them, they follow them? So the temperatures change, then the CO2 levels change, and that's because it's all governed by the sea, for example. I also asked them, well, given that man's carbon dioxide level is only 1/25 of that produced by nature, and also then absorbed by the sea and so forth, how come that man can rule the show if they're only 4% of the total flux of CO2 in and out of the biosphere? And I said, look, to make this work, it requires a conspiracy of nature, whereas nature is following man. Now, this is nonsense, isn't it? But they didn't have an answer, you see. But at least, the point I'm making is, at least the debate was had in University College, which is a setback for the powers that be. No, I'm hoping we'll have a follow-up discussion, and we're willing to talk with anybody. And I hope the Green Party will actually come forward next time instead of dodging out of it, which they did, which I think is a shame.
Yeah, and you can find the actual conference which took place at Conway Hall on windowsontheworld.net and YouTube channel, our YouTube channel, while it's still there.
And it'll be on the weatheraction.com. We'll have the presentation I gave, a longer form that didn't have time to give it all, but that will be up there on a PowerPoint presentation as well.
That's good. That's on weatheraction.com. Yes, the actual video from last year was called Banned Climate Conference Goes Ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Last year, it's not about the one that's just happened.
Correct.
Which was just a meeting.
Yes.
Which unfortunately didn't manage to get the filming we wanted, but nevertheless there are reports around, and we'll make them available.
I refer to that because that was also kicked out of UCL, wasn't
Absolutely.
it? And one of the lecturers actually booked the hall, one of the UCL lecturers, and he himself was found to be turfed out of his own building. Yeah,
which is an utter monstrosity, a disgrace to University College and a disgrace to academia everywhere.
Yeah, and just summing up that, we've got the Grantham Institute here, their website, and their first blog is The Path to a Low Carbon Future. You might have something to say about this before the break, Piers. The Paris Agreement has galvanised global commitment to taking strong action on climate change. To limit the average global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, the future will involve a mix of new technologies, business scenarios, and personal decisions. Now, that's quite interesting. What do they mean by new technologies, business scenarios, and personal decisions? Now, how is this going to limit average global temperature to 2 degrees?
Well, it won't, because global temperature is going down anyway. But they make up stories about what global temperature is doing in order to justify new technologies, businesses, and things you can do. Things you can do personally are part of an ideological game to get people to recycle and make them think they're saving the planet, and therefore they have to discuss or support every other measure. The other measures, new technologies, means things like wind farms, which cost a lot of money and are inefficient. And the business scenarios, of course, means the oil companies saying that they support the action against man-made climate change, so long as, and I quote from their websites, Exxon or BP, so long as there is a uniform price for carbon across the board. Now, that means that the price of energy has to go up sufficiently so that when they want a farmer to burn maize as biofuel, i.e. burn food, he's got to be paid a high enough price, i.e. more than he would be paid if he was to sell it, to turn it into something, a breakfast for some children. So the price has to go up. Now, that automatically means the profit on all the oil collected and so forth goes up. So it's a no-brainer for the oil companies to back the climate change story 100%, and they do.
Absolutely. And if you want to have a look on the Grantham Institute, you'll see a cartoon on there called The Future We See. It says it's an animated film that encourages the public to think about how technologies can help to create a future without greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that is absolutely outrageous to say something like that when they're talking about greenhouse gas emissions.
And they invest in oil.
Exactly.
This Grantham invests in oil himself. So the idea that he's saving the planet is nonsense. He's making up a scenario to increase profits of the oil companies and regiment people into whatever scenario the United Nations or the European Union dictates. So whatever you might think about European Union or climate change, think about this. The global warming scenario works to control and exploit you.
Absolutely right, Piers. And we've talked about quite a few things there. We're going to have a break for a couple of minutes. And, well, but first, actually, Tony, is there anything in the chat box that you'd like to bring up? Because I know we've got a couple of minutes.
Well, the chat room's been extremely busy tonight. Thanks to everyone for their contributions. A lot of it's kind of off topic, though. Let me see what we've got here. It's relative to shows that you do otherwise. Council tax going up and all that this year.
Oh, yeah.
Right, we've got a new member in the chat tonight, or someone joining us in the chat. Some kind words coming in. I've forgotten where that is now. Caught me out. Oh yeah, Natalie's. Such a fantastic show. I hope you guys are getting on other platforms nice and early. Yes, we are. We're on Spreaker right now. We're doing our own things. Mark, you're doing it on Steemit and a couple of other places, I believe, you've joined up to. Is that right?
I'm going to get the Steemit thing going. I looked at it and I think we can use it as a platform, certainly. I just prefer that people would come to us on the platforms we're already on. As we know that YouTube's getting a bit dicey these days. We never know when that's going to be taken down. As we know, Richie Allen's channel got taken down. He's put up a new channel. But it's highly inconvenient, all this stuff, because the YouTube archive is very, very big. And we've got loads of information on it. And what it does is it cuts you off from a huge amount of people, which is a real problem. We do go out on BitChute, but we don't seem to get the hits on that. But BitChute works more on a torrent. I don't know exactly how it works, but it seems to be that the more the video is put out there, the more people will see it. But it's a good backup, and the Spreaker is going really well, and we'd like people to actually tell people about that and give them the link to Spreaker, because we're doing very well on Spreaker, and that's something that we are in control of because we pay them to be on it. So it's not like YouTube where we can just have the carpet pulled from underneath us. So it would be very good if people join us on Spreaker. Is there anything else there, Tony, before we go to the break?
Yeah, I'd just like to add a bit more to that as well. We're also building a new site, and we're well aware of what's been going on. We've been aware of this for 4, 5 or 6 years even, what's coming. And it might be that we have to get to a point where we have to get a server in Iceland just to be able to broadcast the sort of thing that we do. And it might also be that any of the other platforms that you start joining could get taken over, because that's what's happened. That's what happened to YouTube, and it's just as likely to happen to other platforms in the future. So you need to come to Windows on the World, because we're always going to have an answer to how we will broadcast while we're free to do so. So please do that.
That's really good, Tony. Yes, if people can actually go to that live page on the website, it's a convenient place to listen to the show, and it's also a link you can share. You can just share that link with people. I don't do a great amount of publicity on Facebook and platforms like that because I don't really have time to do it. I'm actually extremely busy. And last night we was given a talk. Well, I was given a talk in a squat down in Norwood Junction. And we ended up staying there the night because we couldn't get back home. Norwood still seems to be in the middle of nowhere.
It's not that far from Brixton, actually.
I know, but it's a very strange thing. We couldn't get a bus home, and the trains had stopped. So we came back this morning. But that was interesting. And you get people asking these sort of questions which imply that they don't really want to do any research themselves. And I don't think our listeners are like that. But one fellow, we kept interrupting, and he's going, "But how do you know all this?" I said, "Because I don't watch television." And people are kind of amazed that you want to know this, which it always really surprises me that they have this kind of incredulous attitude as to why anybody would want to even bother, which is probably why we're in the state we're in, and which is why the BBC are getting away with painting your brother as a communist in front of the Kremlin. The Kremlin? Yes.
The Kremlin, yeah.
Yes.
One, yeah.
I thought I'd bring that up for the third time because it's so preposterous. And as I say, we've got a contact down in Salisbury, and he's having a bit of a jolly up about the whole thing too. He said, "I can't say too much because there's loads of spooks around." I think he was saying that rather tongue-in-cheek. So we're going to have a break now, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Right, this is Callum Bigdom and Defiance. You can find him on YouTube, played with permission. More good tunes on there. Cheers, Callum.
Extraordinary victory. Morning and welcome everyone. Anti-austerity protesters as the colour of the next 5 years of Tory Conservative government here in the UK. I'm here because austerity is going to kill me. Cutting the welfare budget and that is going to just cause untold damage. I want everyone to be absolutely clear what we are here to do and who we are here to do it for. crisis. We took child benefit away from people. Disability living is being replaced. Take up a risk with the economy. In defiance, this government's proposed increased cuts to welfare, in education, in health, in housing.
There's people here today who feel that they want to have a society that cares for all, rather than make lectures about the need for further cuts in public spending. Well, it's going to cost you over £1. I don't buy the value slice loaf. I've got a bread maker.
which I can report on. Old Kent Road.
Yeah.
And
live now. So we're live now, Tony.
We're live now. I've got a problem with my mic. I've no idea what's going on here.
That's all right, Tony. Yeah, okay. So we were talking about Trump, Merkel, and May, and Macron.
Correct.
And I think we're going to go back to where we started from. So, Piers.
Yes. They've joined together to denounce the Russians, I think, for different reasons. Trump wants to stand up to, just say, you know, he wants to stand against the Russians who basically defeated the Americans in Syria. But Merkel, Macron and May are uniting together in order to boost the European Union against the Russian threat, and hopefully to sort of blackmail, bribe or trick the British public into not going for Brexit. Now, of course, it won't work, but, you know, I think that is what they're doing. But in reality, the European Union is now in deep trouble. Greece, you see, we've got people basically starving because the European Central Bank is confiscating their homes if they owe more than a certain amount of debt. And Italy has just voted massively against the European Union, in effect. So if what that election says is carried forward, it will mean the end of the European Union. Now, the main beneficiaries of the European Union, in fact, the only beneficiary really, is Germany. And I would say that is essentially the Fourth Reich, which is what they're cooking up. So Merkel then, as essentially the head of all this operation, is going to be in trouble. And, well, my information is there's going to be very serious trouble raised against Merkel even early next week. So who knows, although she thinks her position as the Chancellor has just been, you know, reconfirmed, it may actually suddenly be undermined because of mutinous things, exposures of things that she hoped would be kept secret, and so forth. So watch this space for early next week, you know, the 20th, 21st or so of March.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because there's been a lot of protests against Merkel all across Germany, which have obviously been kept out of the mainstream.
Absolutely.
And those we have seen on stations like Russia Today, and of course they were talking about taking Russia Today off the air, which is totally ludicrous, a bit like they did with Press TV. And there was quite a lot of strong words on that subject today. So it's very unlikely they take Russia Today off. What do you think, Piers, on that, just as a last...
Would they take Russia Today off? I don't know. I mean, if they do, probably people will watch it more and more, because you can find these things on the internet and so forth. You know, I think the days of suppressing people are numbered unless the powers that be can get more and more control over alternative media. Now, they are closing down websites all over the place, but I don't know if they can do it fast enough. So, you know, everyone listening, you have to do everything you can to defend your right to hear everything you want on the internet.
And remember that Ofcom are not an independent body. No. They are very politically orientated, and I believe, again, probably, in my opinion, they're just under the intelligence services, and they are being instructed what to do. I say that because several years ago, a friend of mine actually exposed massive corruption on these gaming channels. He was working for a company, and what Ofcom did to him was really shocking. In fact, Jackie Smith wrote to many MPs about it. It was brought up in the House of Commons, because when he reported on this, and he was actually a whistleblower in the true sense of the word, and he wanted it all to go into court, because we're talking about defrauding the public out of millions. Ofcom phoned up his girlfriend and told her that he'd committed suicide. And that's a very, very strange thing. Was brought up in Parliament. Piers is looking over me quite shocked here, but I've actually got the evidence of that. I've got all the emails, and I've got the letter from Jackie Smith MP. So people should be very sceptical of Ofcom. And yes, you're right. It's much better if these platforms just survive on the internet. Press TV probably did lose quite a lot of viewers, but that never had a huge audience anyway. But it's good to get these different perspectives. We can't take any perspective for granted. And it looks like today there was 3 different perspectives going on in the room.
Yeah, it was good. It was
and
very good.
You can read between the lines. I particularly like what Alexandra Necroshoff said. I thought it was very much appealed to my direct kind of line in looking at these things. And the way he actually described certain British politicians as basically useless buffoons who couldn't do a proper job, to me sums them up perfectly. But we're going to move on now to something that we talk about a lot: social cleansing, the bigger picture, regeneration, what's happening to London. And I've been with Piers to quite a few of these meetings, especially the Elephant and Castle Regeneration meeting, where we found they were splitting us up into groups using a thing called Delphi technique, which we talk about quite a lot, which is a way of gaining group consensus. It's all psychological subversion, really. And it's going on a mass scale, and people are reporting it all over the country, and we have people contacting us from all over the country. And guess what? The template's the same everywhere. Now, how could this be? Well, it could be that there's a global action plan being implemented at a local level, and it's an unstructured governance, and the UN are behind it. And no, it's not a conspiracy theory, Clyde Lokes in Waltham Forest, because you're enforcing it on behalf of those very people, those very organisations. You may not think it with your 24% pay rise, but when you actually stated that the show that we put out called London's Dystopia, the public winning fight back, which featured housing officers and people really in the know about what's going on, including Gordon Peters, Mr. Lokes referred to this as a hugely discredited conspiracy theory, and he didn't subscribe to it whatsoever. And he found it quite laughable that anybody would, which really backfired nicely on him. And I asked him 8 questions, including would he actually meet me face to face in front of his constituents for a debate. Went very quiet. So the regeneration carries on, and Waltham Forest is actually going to have a 29-storey tower block, higher than Centrepoint opposite the station. Now, we're talking about a place which has been totally transformed within 2 years, as has most of South London, where you are down the Old Kent Road. That's right, isn't it?
That is absolutely right.
So what do you think the solutions are, and what are you seeing? What are you actually seeing? Because you go to quite a lot of these meetings, don't you? Got a lot of tenants meetings.
Sure.
What's happening?
Well, there's some very important things going on now. I mean, the basic thing is regeneration all over London is not for us. It's a scam whereby the local councils work hand in glove with developers. They declare they need developers in order to develop and build housing, but when the housing is built, you find it's actually a social cleansing operation to remove secure council tenants from the area, generally speaking, throwing them out, first of all, the local area and then later out of London, and promote expensive properties for developers to sell, or the more expensive ones are sold to be kept empty by money launderers, which include Russian oligarchs, Chinese, whatever, and British speculators, of course. However, there's a bit of spanner in the works now, namely the advent of ballots becoming a necessity, which must be carried out in any regeneration scheme, subject to certain exceptions. And this has happened. Now the Mayor of London has declared there must be ballots, and this has followed Labour Party policy, and my brother and others making it very clear at the Labour conference that we had to have democratic accountability. Specific things have taken place. First of all, the Elephant and Castle, where the issue of ballots has been raised a bit, but nothing's actually been decided on how to do a ballot, but it must be logical that there should be some ballots in the Elephant and Castle, which has made councillors somewhat defensive. The main developer, Delancey, an offshore theft operation, have now stepped back a bit from their plan because it's got massive opposition. And the councillors that opposed it are still opposing it, despite certain concessions having been given by Delancey. Basically, Delancey want to build 979 luxury flats on the Elephant and Castle, and as a sop to the locals, they promised to build 33 properties, 3% for social rent, and now they've doubled this to 74 or something like that, or more than doubled it. Well, of course, this is just a pathetic little prick as to what is needed. So councillors, to be fair, many of whom have backed developers before, are not backing them now, and Delancey have postponed the plan, which was deferred, but they've postponed coming back to the planning committee until after the election. And meanwhile, the students are getting up in arms about it, because the students in what was the London College of Printing, and now part of the University of Arts, had an occupation to protest against the role of their governing body in this plan, because the plan includes the relocation of them to somewhere else, and Delancey being able to use that piece of land to make loads of money. And the students have said they don't like being used. They don't think their university should be a social cleansing machine. And they are talking about, or actually, as we speak, going around schools and places where universities recruit from to say, do not go to the University of Arts. It's a social cleansing university. And I would like everyone listening to this to make that point to any school children you know that are thinking of applying to University of Arts. Don't do it. While the university is hand in glove with a social cleansing developer, don't apply. Go to somewhere else. There are plenty of other universities around.
Seems like quite a lot of this is getting found out now. It looked for quite some time as though it was just steamrolling on regardless. The disruption with the Harringay development vehicle was quite interesting. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, though, at the moment, because it looks as though this HDV project is actually going ahead. They were all tweeting about it the other day, so I sent them our show, which of course you never get a response. That went to Claire Kober. I think she's had our show about 20 times now, but there's never been any response. But they're actually saying that what a great idea the HDV is. So there seems to be some kind of force behind that. Have you got any information on that?
Well, I would say I think the HDV is in very serious trouble, but the clique who were promoting it still want to hang on. However, after the May elections, they're going to be in an even more difficult position. So I think it's essentially dead, partly because they've been politically defeated, but secondly because Harringay is not near enough to inner London. They can't do the money laundering operations for big investors that they can, like in Elephant and Castle area, because the properties are never going to be worth, or not yet, worth enough in Harringay, which is away from the centre. So I think they're in Cloud Cuckoo Land thinking it will carry on. But that's my thought. But I think it's worth mentioning at this point, I can't add to that, is what's happening in the Old Kent Road, which is basically the council want to create 5 Haygate estates. Now, the Haygate estate demolition is the most embarrassing, disgraceful thing which a council has done next to the Aylesbury estate, but they haven't succeeded there yet, and I don't think they ever will. But the Haygate, they removed everybody, even though promising that they would have equal numbers of council housing built on the patches was destroyed, and they built none at all. But the Old Kent Road, way up the Old Kent Road, they want to do a whole lot more of the same thing again and again. Now, because of the advent of ballots, will have to be ballots in areas or for the whole thing or something. So that has really empowered tenants association to say, hang on, regeneration is meant to be in our interest. That's what it's about. The powers that be come along and say, you've got a problem, okay, we want to regenerate you to help solve the problem. So we know from experience that this is a pack of lies, and the so-called helping is actually destruction of our communities and essentially killing people through depression and loss of meaning of their life and community, and there are suicides as a consequence.
We've actually reported on this about 18 months ago. This basically to implement this corporate infrastructure with everything, which again ties into this Agenda 21, when General Petrov said that as a result of this Rio Earth Summit, this may seem a bit off topic to people, but it's not, because I couldn't understand how all of this stuff was being implemented so quickly within a couple of years with no planning and no real consent from the public. But he said that all the banks got together and the major corporations and said, we will look after all infrastructure that concerns the public and all problems of rich and poor. And this is being done with this massive corporate infrastructure. Makes absolute sense, but it's to destroy existing communal venues, the libraries, we reported on this, and really any decent little centres and self-employed places, and basically to put in this absolutely uniform structure, which is the same everywhere. London is now just being replicated all over the place as one big shopping mall with flats.
That's right. If you look down the Old Kent Road, their new plan, that they've amended the plan as a result of consultation, right? Well, this amended plan has got what they call a town centre, which stretches from Elephant and Castle to New Cross. all along the road. Now, this using the phrase town centre gives them more planning powers to oust people they don't like. That's all they've done it for. It's a complete con to call a centre, something that long. It's nonsense. But very specifically, the tenants and residents associations in my neighbourhood forum, which is Walworth East Neighbourhood Forum, about 5 TAs, have said, look, you say this regeneration is for us. Well, we are very suspicious, so we want to opt out of the regeneration area. Now, this must be our democratic right, and that's a resolution being passed at the neighbourhood forum. So they've got a big problem, these councillors, because look, we have to have a right to opt out if they say it's for us. We say, well, we don't think it is.
But as the UN quite rightly tell us, Piers, nobody will be left behind.
So there's a big democratic test coming on, and if the powers that be don't like it, we'll have ballots in all these tenants associations and we'll opt out. Because if you stay in there, they're going to use extra powers against you by saying it's a business opportunity zone, which means a social cleansing zone.
Yes, this business opportunity zone doesn't actually seem to include the local businesses, does it? As we found out, the
local businesses are up in arms about it. They've been well, basically, the council tells the residents, "Oh, the businesses go along with this," which is not true, and they tell the council tells the businesses, "Oh, tenants want to be regenerated." Completely untrue.
Well, it actually is, and let's just have a bit of a recap as to what all this is about. Savills wrote a document called Complete Streets, which was a full demolition model of all the council housing, and our mayor was actually up for this before he was mayor. Is this correct or not, or is this a rumour? Because this was stated at the time, about 18 months ago, that he was in favour of this full demolition model before he was mayor.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's the case that the Sadiq Khan was funded part of his election by developers. I mean, okay, developers will fund all sorts of people to get a look in, but I mean, for him to accept money from developers, I think was bad. And I don't think anyone should accept money from developers. They are the enemy of the people.
Exactly, and he should be reminded of that now, I think, because it would take his mind off the trivia and maybe focus on something of importance, in my opinion.
That's right.
So, but Savills were writing policy for local authorities. This is Savills, the estate agents, and Yolanda Barnes from Savills actually stated that this was a great opportunity for a land grab. I'm kind of paraphrasing there, but that's really what she said. In other words, that London was great real estate and should be exploited to the maximum.
Absolutely.
So that's not really got anything to do with so-called social housing or what they actually call communities. Vibrant communities, of course.
Oh, they're always building vibrant communities. They've already, every time they're building a vibrant community, it means they've just destroyed a vibrant community. Now, the Harringay estate, whatever you might say about it, and, it needed some work doing, but it was deliberately left like that in order to make it in need of repair. But it was a vibrant community. They had big meetings, those tenants, and they supported each other, and that has all been destroyed. And that's what they're trying to do on the Aylesbury estate. But again, Aylesbury estate tenants and residents are fighting back. And for those who don't realise it, 3/4 of the Aylesbury estate is still standing, with tenants and leaseholders uniting together to stop the demolition plan in its tracks. And we hope to succeed. The inquiry into the compulsory purchase order for one part of the estate is going to resume on the 17th of April. And that is an important thing. But whatever happens there, tenants and leaseholders in the other parts are standing together.
As far as people being socially cleansed out of London, this is something that seems to be going on a very large scale. However, not much reported. Can you give us any information on that? Are you aware of this sort of migration of people being offered properties out of London? Have you any idea on what sort of scale this is happening?
Well, people from the ASH,
that's Architects for Social Housing.
Architects for Social Housing came up with some figures about that in a meeting recently, which I found alarming. They talked about hundreds of families a month. Now, I don't have the figures in front of me, but you see, the trick, it's done in stages. Basically, the council will say to tenants on an estate, well, you've got to go because we're going to regenerate this, blah, blah, blah. And you might be able to come back or you might not, but they'll give promises which don't mean anything. But anyway, they'll move these tenants out, usually secure tenants, most of whom will be moved to other secure tenancies, probably of lower standard, but in the same borough. And then temporary tenants will be moved in to the estate. And those temporary tenants will have less rights. And then they will get moved out as the estate is demolished and then new properties built for the super rich. But they'll be moved out into housing association properties and then get shoved out of London, because the housing associations are now developers and there's nothing to stop them. And it's clear that Notting Hill Housing Trust and the Genesis Housing Association, who merged, are hell bent on making money, and that includes simply managing social housing rather than building it. So they're managing it and will sell it when they need to. And it's through that route that most of the families are actually shoved out of London. You see, because the temporary tenants I mentioned, of course, come from London anyway, and the secure tenants that are relocated in the borough have just been relocated to other tenancies where, for whatever reason, those are tenants who maybe have already moved out of London. So the net effect is shunting tenants, secure tenants, or replacement secure tenants out of London. And the film Daniel Blake, of course, is exactly centred around one such woman and her children who were shunted out of London, basically as socially cleansed people.
Yes, this is quite a disturbing aspect to it.
Very much so.
I've had a few people contact me who it's happened to, so it's good to try and get some context to this as to how many. But to give the listeners some idea of what's going on here, as part of the Savills Complete Streets Full Demolition model, it stated that 58,000 new homes would be built on hotspot city villages. Now, city villages is this project which was backed by Lord Adonis. And
Lord Adonis, yeah.
Yes. And we reported on that 18 months ago. And obviously it's now taking hold and it's everywhere. But that's something to think about. 58,000 new homes in these hotspot city villages, which are these places of high density around tube stations. And it was Peter O'Kane, ex-housing officer for Hackney, who stated that this proposed demolition or refurbishment and demolition of tower blocks in Leytonstone was part of this. And he said he couldn't quite understand, even though he does in the bigger picture understand what it's about. He said, from a point of view of practicality, it doesn't make any sense implementing this density of housing in these areas because they are not around tube stations. So it's not just going on around tube stations. This high density, this Agenda 21 housing, which is basically flats that are around 10 to 12 feet wide and 30 feet long. These are the living spaces that they've designated, which were brought in by Mayor Bloomberg in New York years ago. That was all part of the Agenda 21. It's getting people living in very small spaces, very cramped. And also what's been reported from America is that we have an example here as well in Chelsea, I believe. They're building these blocks which are like communal. So they're also that they have communal areas where people can work on their computers together. So that in effect, these are places of mass brainwashing in the making, because they want these young 30-somethings who are earning money, enough money to buy somewhere in these developments. And in America, he was saying that these are basically recruiting the people who are got the Agenda 21 mentality. In other words, people who walk and cycle everywhere and do not want anybody driving a car. So it's quite interesting the way it's being put into place, because California is quite a long way ahead of the UK in their implementation of these policies. And you can go onto YouTube, look at California's housing, and also look at the tent cities there, because we're now getting into a kind of they live scenario with these tent cities in California going on for miles. And these aren't people who are down and outs. These are people who've lost their homes. And not just from 2008, but it's happening. California with the fires, they're bringing in new rules on the rebuilding, which make it very difficult for people to live there. And they're actually saying we shouldn't be living here. We should all be coming into the cities. So this is a global action plan. But this level of housing, this high density of housing, is draconian because it's pushing people into these tiny, cramped areas. And when I look at where I used to live, Waltham Forest, it's totally unrecognisable. And all the area around the station, they're narrowing the roads everywhere. This is another thing, narrowing the roads, making 40-foot pavements, putting tree planters everywhere, and then they're putting benches on places where you just wouldn't want to sit. And then they're putting the homeless, unfriendly benches everywhere.
Oh,
which
right,
means that
absolutely.
you can't actually spread out on them. Yes, and it's starting to look a little bit similar everywhere. In other words, it's a global thing because everywhere's starting to look the same. Maybe people are picking up on that now because there's no area that's got anything unique about it. I mean, Waltham Forest looks particularly stupid because they closed all the roads off and put tree planters in the middle of the roads. And it all looks temporary, but it's permanent. And the next step from this is going to be gated communities. They're already talking about it, and there's something I was going to run by you here, Piers, which some people may say this is a conspiracy theory, but I'm starting to hear it, and this came from a very good source in America, Deborah Tavares, and she's been studying what's been going on with the Delphi technique, exposing it for years, and at these local town hall meetings with facilitators and the control of their privatising the water supply, taking away wells, this kind of thing. Right. But I just wondered what you thought about it, because there seems to be this agenda now where you're getting areas that are, let's put it this way, London has always had poor areas right next to very rich areas, right? Yeah. So you've got these hugely expensive houses right by a council estate. I mean, Maida Vale was a great example of that. I used to live just on the canal there. But the thing is that what's being reported is the police are now reporting very high crime levels in Waltham Forest, a lot more stabbings, a lot more violent things happening. And I was told a long time ago that this was going to be introduced. And this is also in that lecture by Dr. Richard Day of 1969 called Social Engineers, Then and Now, and Social Engineers, which you can see on windowsontheworld.net. They are audios, and all of the links to all of the documents that were produced from that talk by Dr. Richard Day in 1969, which predicted what was going to happen, are on there. And he was stating that this would happen. Crime was going to be encouraged because they wanted to create this. Yes, they wanted to create this fear mentality. In other words, how do we protect ourselves from crime? More surveillance, giving the state more and more power. We were told this week, a friend of mine sent me this thing about this Amazon Echo. Now, the police are going to be using this for intelligence, and they're going to be putting out who's wanted in your area on this Amazon Echo. And Lancashire Police, I think, have partnered with them. We're going to do something on this next week. But this ties again into this Crime Stoppers thing, a thing of total surveillance, a thing called fearless.org, which is getting everyone to snitch on each other. So when you look at it in the bigger picture, it's beyond Orwellian what's going on, and it's happened very quickly. Now, the question, I'm going to get to it now, is do you think that this is something that is being introduced? Do you think it's possible that crime is being kind of farmed in these areas and encouraged, or the police are stepping down and letting it happen? Because it seems to be that the reported crimes are going up and the police aren't doing anything about it.
Well, I can't sure I can answer that directly, but I would say that, crime figures depend on reportage, and the police can choose to either report or not report. And obviously crime will get encouraged if they make themselves absent. So that's another thing. And having more crime figures is useful for them to justify whatever they want to do. And they say, oh, yeah, we've got to demolish this or do that and so forth. And crime is always used in regenerations as an excuse for something or other. And it usually is preceded by bringing in community police in order to monitor stuff and declare a problem and then get figures to show there's more of a problem than they thought, because they've actually gone around looking for problems to report on. So, but is there actually more crime going on, and is it being encouraged? Well, could be. It could be. You see, I wouldn't put anything past these developers who want to make loads of money. To me, though, what I notice, these communities, not communities, these anti-communities, these replacement communities being built are like Swiss lavatories, if you like. I mean, they're just bits of concrete, overbearing buildings, not enough space between them, and very alienating. And I would think those structures themselves will generate crime, because people don't have any community feel that they had before. You see, London is a mosaic of, or was a mosaic of, different communities, different social groups, different racial origin groups, you know, Irish here, Nigerian there, Moroccan here, English here, and so forth, you know, and that is all being destroyed in a kind of uniformity which I find really unacceptable and weakening to people's feeling of togetherness and community and well-being and meaning. And I would say Walworth, as it's been known for 1,000 years, is now being destroyed. The Walworth of Charlie Chaplin is gone. The Walworth of Michael Faraday has gone. The Walworth of the General Strike, where the Walworth people were really, you know, solidly behind the General Strike. All these communities there are being destroyed. The Walworth even of 1648, where, I don't know if you probably don't know this, Mark, but the May Day festivals then used to last a week. 1648, the year before 1649, if you recall, when King Charles had his head chopped off. But 1648, there were big demonstrations to defend the Long Parliament, which is, you know, various things going on. But the point was, the people of Walworth were up in arms, and they even attacked they attacked various places, you know, and got cannon fired from the other side of the river upon them for doing what they were doing. But you see, the Walworth community then, for the last, 500 years, has been a meaningful place where people stood together, and that has been destroyed. And I want to take up something else you said about tube stations. Very interesting. You see, on the Old Kent Road, the council have been proudly saying that, the development will bring along 3 new tube stations. Now, for the last 40 years, no one has been talking about building a tube station on the Old Kent Road, except as pie in the sky. Given it's now the best bus route in the world, probably, there's no need for a tube station. But what we say about tube stations is, a developer, if you live near a tube station, anywhere, or not one, but there's a possible one, I would say a developer near you wants you to want a tube station near you so they can socially cleanse you. And the council are proudly saying, we're going to build tower blocks first of all, beside the new tube stations, in order to pay for the new tube stations. Now look, I don't need a tube station on the Old Kent Road because the buses are good enough. But the developers want them because they can draw in certain well-off people and thereby increase land values, bring in people which are not part of the local community, and expel those who are. So a tube station is part of a social cleansing operation. So if you see a tube station being planned, just say no.
That may sound quite absurd to some people who don't know this plan and the way it works, but it's absolutely correct. And what I was going to bring up also is this new meaning of community. Now, we've been up against it. We've had to get our building back. Well, our building, I became a trustee of a charity to help somebody who's a great friend of mine who was doing great work. And she's got attacked by people who call themselves a community. So it's a very insidious thing that people all of a sudden refer to themselves as a community. And they seem to imply that they have this sense of entitlement over you. In other words, you're not part of our community. I've seen some really shocking stuff that relates to this, in the respect that groups are going into public venues and saying, well, we don't think it's a safe space, so you've got to have us here and you've got to pay us. Well, it's up to the venue to supply the safe space. This again ties into what is going on with this corporate takeover, because I believe these two mentalities are very linked, and I say that with some confidence after the research I've done into it and what's going to come out of the next few weeks. We have gone into this in recent weeks in a broad level, but I wanted to bring it together in the next few weeks, because what we're seeing is PR companies are doing this as well. They're creating their own narrative. As we reported last week, they're creating their own narrative by identifying key members of the community. Now, wait a minute, a PR company who works for the developers, they decide...
Probably an offshore developer.
Yeah, well, they decide who's your community. So what they do is they bring in a PR company to put out these phony consultations, and from the consultations, they glean the sort of people they want. In other words, the people who want to build cycle lanes everywhere. Oh, that's handy because that's part of what we're going to do. The people who want the so-called regeneration, and Chris was talking about this, who's in Hertford a few weeks ago, about these sort of bigger developments that are going on outside London, which seem to be more of kind of an elite kind of development. In other words, they're houses rather than tiny little flats, which the ones in the centre are. But what he was saying is that these PR companies are recruiting people, and I'm seeing this all over. It's a template. So it's like a form of shadow government that people don't know about inside their own area. I won't call it community, I call it area. So people are not aware of this. These people come in, they take over, and all of a sudden they're the community and you're not. And that's simply how it's done, because your voice then is not heard. The small businessman is kind of confused by it, because he's getting hit by the council. They're doing him no favours at all. He's not hearing anything about what's going on, and all of a sudden there's no parking spaces and no one's buying his stuff. That's when they find out. But they don't often know what's behind it. And it's quite interesting, because you go to these businesses that have been there a long time, like cafes, etc.
They're really depressed. Very depressed. Very upset.
Absolutely. And they are not aware that the people who are actually implementing this have been brought in. They don't know anything about the way it's working. So it's like a shadow government locally. That's something I wanted to bring up, because that was very apparent at the Elephant and Castle meeting, wasn't it? When we went down there, they were already advertising the new community hub. Now, a lot of these places have their own community areas, but these are not the ones they want. So the narrative is being controlled on a level that most people in this country would not even believe could be possible. Now, I'm not overstating that, because I've done a lot of research into it. Now, what I was going to ask you, Piers, is your brother aware of this kind of thing?
Well, he is aware of it, and there's a lot of things he has to be aware of. But you see, he's always been part of the community around Finsbury Park, and before that he was a Harringay councillor, where he was very much part of the community, and he could go to any cafe or whatever and they'd welcome him and he could find out what's going on. But you're absolutely right, you see. I mean, obviously in Islington the council is better than most, because they follow his lead on these things, but he goes to many places and can see that the community meaning of businesses and shops is often being lost and undermined through parking controls, for example, and of course favouritism being given to supermarkets, which undermines these things. Now, I know business retailers who are just really pissed off. They just say to me, "Look, there ain't no business anymore in retail, you know, because of the various factors going against them. People use the internet more and so on." But you see, shop owners or shop managers often don't really have much of a say in the locality, because obviously the people who vote primarily are residents, and these guys who are paying the council tax or business council tax don't actually have a vote. They do get consulted, but I think there has to be a way of giving them more say in making, you know, the shopping communities continue to work.
Well, that's it, really. I mean, it's just awareness, isn't it? And that awareness is obviously growing. Because what's interesting about this is that it's been implemented extremely quickly over the past few years. And as we reported, that the public maybe starting to win some kind of fight back, because I think what happens is when these people get caught, for want of a better phrase, their noses in the trough, then they are fully exposed within this, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, I mean, we've got a rumour that one leading councillor who's about to leave is going to join a developer as soon as he's left. Well, he's been asked this in public and hasn't been giving a straight answer. Well, after the May elections, we'll find out what it is. But that is a problem, that the developers and councillors work hand in glove, and they are interchangeable. Councillors become developers and developers become councillors. Well, this is completely unacceptable. We have to have a ban on any councillor working for a developer for at least 5 years after they've ended office. Otherwise, we're just going to be run by international capital on behalf of money laundering thieves from around the world, and we can't stand this.
That was referred to quite a bit tonight, but also the bigger picture of it. What do you see happening? Do you see that there is any way of turning this around?
Yes, there is. The fight for accountability at a local level through ballots. If you see a regeneration happening, then demand your right to withdraw from it, because I can't see any argument against that. The regenerations are meant to be for the people being regenerated. Now, we know they're not, but that is the law. That's what it's about. So we must be able to withdraw. Well, they can't develop an empty, i.e. nothing, if everybody withdraws. That's the end of the development, right? So, or the regeneration. So we have to do that. And we have to fight for accountability at all levels. Now, planning decisions are not that easy to accountability under, if you see what I mean, because you have to comply by planning law. But the first thing to get clear is the councillors do not have to change use from industrial, light industrial, like in the Oaken Road, into residential. But of course they're doing that sort of thing, rushing to do it in order to give the developers the look-in they need. Now, they don't need to make these decisions. They don't need to invite developers to do anything. The councils can do things themselves, and quite frankly, if all these estates regenerated had nothing done to them, the people on them would be happier, because the councils would be forced to do at least minimal repairs and maintenance. And minimal repairs and maintenance under the law are pretty adequate to keep places going properly. And that's what we ought to be looking at, how they're dodging doing proper repairs and maintenance in order to justify bringing in developers and socially cleansing.
Yes, and in conclusion, that show we did a few weeks ago about the tower blocks in Leytonstone, after that show, I've no idea whether it had anything to do with it. I'm not claiming any authorship for this, but it was dropped by the local council and the development has been halted. So there is some kind of hope in there, and it has been turned around a little bit in Harringay, although they're starting to try and fight back. I mean, it's disingenuous, in my opinion. These people who are meant to be representing the local community, whatever that means anymore, well, they are actually pushing this corporate agenda still as though it's a great idea. And these people are unbelievably arrogant. But
yeah,
they're not,
absolutely.
They're not very bright. They're actually quite stupid, in my opinion, from what I've seen, because if they were that bright, they wouldn't be doing it so brazenly and openly and basically leaving themselves open. Which is what they're doing in a way, isn't it?
They are leaving themselves open, yeah, because they're so arrogant and believe that people... Well, they believe their own narrative, you see. Yes. They say, oh, we're short of money. We need to do things for the estate because it needs doing. And the only people who can help us are developers. So we've got to have a partnership with developers. You've got to let them have so many blocks and blah, blah, and then give them control, and then they'll do what they want. So... they just give away control and control and control. And before you know it, like on the Harringay, when they promised to keep the same number of council housing, the developers said, piss off. We're going to give none, zero, nothing. And they said, oh, OK. And they just rolled over. Well, these aren't the sort of people that should be representing anybody. But that is the sort of councillors around London right now. However, you stand up to them, you will find some which will stand up. And that is happening now in the Elephant. And let's see let's see if it continues. But certainly, things are moving in our direction and against developers.
That's very good news. So, Tony, in conclusion for today's show, have we got anything in the chat that you'd like to report?
Cool, chat's going mad. Can you hear me? I think you can. Yep. Sorry about the earlier problems with the desk gremlins in the works, but yeah,
Not
incredibly busy.
MI5 or MI6?
Yes, we're under attack here. This is serious, folks. We're under attack.
Yeah.
This is the revolution.
Yeah, so what we got?
Philip in there doing something, or Angela Merkel maybe, she's doing something against us.
Yeah, the numbers have dropped down in the chat. Again, people, if you're not signed into Chatango with an account, you will get booted out of there as an anonymous whatever, so it might be worth signing up. But Eric says Hereford Council have formed a housing company and teamed up with a property developer. They openly admitted it in their propaganda magazine.
Well, that's interesting, Tony,
Really?
because Hereford is very underpopulated.
Yeah.
So maybe they've got plans for a tube station in Hereford.
I wonder.
Yeah, Eric also
I used to
says...
live in Shropshire near Hereford. We always thought Hereford was a backwater, but maybe it's suddenly going to become a skyscraper place. Who knows?
It's an amazingly beautiful
It
place.
is actually. It is
Yeah.
actually. There could be opportunities for there. Vladimir, you could have a tower block overlooking the Downs.
I'm
yeah?
going to call it
Or the mountains.
New Avalon.
New Avalon.
Yeah,
Not New
Avalon.
Hereford.
Yes. The flats are
Well,
going
it's a
to
beautiful
be
place. That's
30 feet by 10, self-contained studios, and this is a legendary place, and we're going to get as many people on our side as we can in the local community.
Ah, yes. Well, if they're
Watch
living there,
out
they'll
for
be
them.
local and community, won't they?
That's right. So watch out for people moving in.
Even if they're second homes from somebody living in Malaysia, who knows?
Yeah, shelf companies, that sort of thing. Those are the sort of people we want in there. We want to keep the place underpopulated, but we want to make some money.
Anyway, let's see what else is on.
Yeah, come on.
Eric also says, my local council has formed a property rental business called Badger Investments. A local...
We know all about that. Yes. Well, we know about one in Hartford, actually. So that's interesting. Is it the same one that's in Hartford, I wonder?
I don't know, but
a similar spelling. Is there a reason?
he says he says a councillor is a director of the company or the director of the
Right.
company.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds
It's
like a nice little job.
interesting.
Nice.
These sort of people should be held to account. She said, well, which are you going to do? Are you working for the people or working for a developer? I mean, they should be just out.
Mm-hmm. Babushka says, wait till the third-party buyer comes along and buys social housing or kicks in. So, yeah, I guess what you're saying, it gets taken over, privatised and all that. Well, it's
Oh,
already
yes.
happening.
In parts of Wandsworth, we got people that have done right to buys, then become the owners, and then they've sold on to single developers. And so you got handfuls of like 20 flats in one block, all owned by some landlord who's bought them, as you say, the third person down the line, and then they shoved them full of students. Now, nothing wrong with students having somewhere to live, but the point is students being shoved in these working class communities undermine the communities, because the students have got no interest in the continuity, basically. They'll help out for a week or two, but, it weakens the communities and then paves the way for total demolition as the community gets destroyed. So students ought to go into student accommodation, in my opinion, not be manipulated into a social cleansing operation.
Yep. Martin Houston says, remember the Destroying Britain's Villages show I did was back in... sorry, I'm really struggling with my eyes. I can't blooming read half the time. Right.
You need iodine, mate, or vitamin C.
I've got a virus, Piers, and I'm getting hot and cold sweats and all sorts of weirdness going on. Right, let me get back on with it. Martin says, remember the Destroying Britain Villages show I did? I was back in Arsley in the WEC and building on the massive field has still not started. Maybe developers are starting to lose their nerve about destroying farmland wholesale. Sorry about that. That was a bit me and a bit...
That's interesting, Tony. Maybe they're just sitting on it for the time being, because I'm hearing this from other people that some of these projects are being stalled for one reason or another. So it'd be interesting to find out what the reason is. I do remember that show we did with Martin. It's called Britain's Villages Destroyed ?
Right, yeah.
It would be very handy if people circulated that, because that is actually what's going on in so-called rural areas, and again ties into the global action plan implemented at a local level. It is the future plans for the countryside. So I would watch that show if you're living in a village. It's very informative, and it gives you some ammunition and also what to expect when the change agents turn up.
Okay. Eric says, when the first Letchworth Garden City was made in 1985, there were 17 homes per hectare. Now it's 50 houses per hectare. In London, it's 100 per hectare, and 100 per hectare will soon be the norm throughout the country.
Wow.
Well, it's a lot more than that. If you listen to our show about the high-density housing that are being built, basically these flats around tube stations. And if you hear what Peter O'Kane says about density, it's about 10 times that. So that's really interesting. If you want to listen to that show, that's the density that's they're putting around tube stations. And you can see this everywhere. But what they want is everybody in their own little communal area with their gym, their mini Tesco's, their Costa coffee, and maybe a cinema. And that's going to be it. And of course, they don't want people going out at all. And that's the whole plan. Because by impoverishing people so that they're spending all their money on their accommodation, they haven't got any money to go out, and they're very easy to control. So that's where the BBC comes back in, because all of those widescreen TVs are going to be saying one thing. And it's got nothing to do with actually what's going on.
Yeah, Babushka says...
You've seen the destruction of English village life, actually. I mean, obviously, in the 50 years ago, the majority of the population lived in, or maybe 80 years ago, lived in the countryside as farm workers or whatever, or commuted to towns and so forth. But now the numbers actually living in the countryside is being decreased. And I think that is wrong, because if you live in the countryside, you can develop, your mind can have more space to think. I mean, that's my opinion. I was brought up for the first 9 years of my life living in a small village, and I think it was a very good thing, and I'm glad that happened to me rather than live in a town. I mean, people in towns can certainly, develop ideas of space with parks and all that, but it is more difficult.
Absolutely true, and part of the action plan is to depopulate the countryside. You can see that in the Wildlands Project of America, but more close at home, look at the Wetlands Project in Waltham Forest, and the significance of that might sink in as to why that they're closing off large areas of public space. So that's it for this week. Tony, if there's anything else you'd like to say before we go, apart from catch us on Spreaker and spread the word.
Just a big thank you to everyone who's contributed. Sorry that we couldn't get through all your comments, but I'm sure you agree there was plenty of action from the two fellas there, and we've got some really good information out tonight. Well done, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Right stuff.
Reverse